and for me, okay. Thanks for watching the stream. Syria's President Bashar al-Assad has been welcomed back to the Arab League. What difference will that make to Syrian refugees who are hoping to return home? How safe will they be? That is our episode discussion, and we started with citizen journalist Faraz.
It's important to understand that violations committed by Assad regime are the main reason behind millions of Syrians seeking asylum around the world. Readmitting Assad into the Arab League doesn't mean that Syria is safe again for refugees to return back. But as refugees, we have serious concerns that this kind of normalization could lead to forced return of some refugees in some countries, especially these countries that have intents to renormalize their relations with Assad.
The comment section on YouTube is now live. As always, you're invited to our discussion. Joining us from Berlin, Wafa Mustafa, a Syrian activist and fellow at Refugee International. With us from Stockholm, Amar al-Shogri, Director of Detainee Affairs with the Syrian Emergency Task Force. And in Paris, Marie Forestier, Senior Syria Advisor with the European Institute for Peace. Guests, it's really good to have you here. I am going to start with a comment from the Saudi Foreign Minister about why President Bashar al-Assad was invited back to the Arab League and what the Arab League thinks it will do for Syrians. Let's have a listen. Let's have a look.
The existing situation was not able to continue, and there is no way to solve the Syrian crisis without a dialogue with the Syrian government. And our belief is that the position of Syria is inside the Arab League. Now there are Syrian refugees who are willing to return to their country. We should help them to find the way to return. There is a very difficult economic situation in Syria, all due to the existing situation, which is affecting the Syrian people. Therefore, we are interested in finding practical and realistic solutions, and this will not happen without a partnership with the government in Damascus.
Practical, realistic solution. Omar, does that stop civil war in Syria? Are we on the journey towards the end of civil war in your country?
There is no such thing as a political solution when you're talking about a regime that's still killing its people on a daily basis. Today, the regime has bombed in the countryside of Aleppo, killing people, injuring people. Syria is not safe, and the regime is the reason Syria is not safe. And as long as the regime is killing people on a daily basis, bombing people, detaining people, killing them under torture, that means the regime is not ready for a political solution. That the regime made the lie of political solution just to delay the solution in Syria. The regime would never engage in a conversation that demands the release of the detainees, because for the regime, the detainees are the card they use to put pressure on the families, on the Syrian community. So I do not believe that bringing Assad back to the Arab League is a step forward to bring peace to Syria. It's definitely not going to happen that way.
Wafa, how did you make sense of this happening? Is it to get aid, to get more help into Syria if there are sanctions? That is more difficult. What would be the practical reasons for this happening?
Well, thank you. But let me start by saying that I think that part of why we got here today is that is the narrative, and I think for me it's crucial to highlight that what happened in Syria was not a civil war. People did not flee Syria because of the civil war. People revolted in 2011. People demanded their basic human rights. And then a war was waged by this regime, by this dictatorship against civilians. And so I think, it's important, as Firas highlighted from the Syrian Network for Human Rights, that we start with talking about the root causes. People had to flee Syria. They were forced to flee Syria because of the crimes committed by the Assad regime, and obviously because the Assad regime invited all other governments and states and different kinds of groups to actually play their own struggles in Syria. So I think for someone like me, and I think for any person, such a step should not make any sense. I believe there is no practical reason or mentality behind this normalization. And as Omar said, it does not. We all know that it will not bring any peace. any justice, and it will not end the ongoing war, which is mainly happening because the Assad regime is, as Omar said, still committing crimes against its own people, but also because the Assad regime, maybe the bombing, people claim that the bombing has stopped, which is also not true. But the detention is also still ongoing on daily basis. And we learned also from the Syrian Network for Human Rights that last May witnessed the highest rate of detentions in Syria, and mainly because the regime targeted those who were deported by the Lebanese authority to Syria.
So that question that we asked at the very beginning of the show, how safe is it for Syrian refugees to return to Syria? Omar and Wafa have answered that very clearly. Let me give you some statistics. Marie, help us out with where our refugees are, Syrian refugees. They are in neighbouring countries, up to 5 million of them, next door in Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Egypt. What kind of conditions are they living in? Can we say now, over a decade after Syria became unstable, how are they faring?
Well, most of the Syrian refugees who live in neighboring countries live in extremely difficult situation with unpermanent livelihood, difficulty to access healthcare, education, livelihood opportunities. They are under pressure. A number of them don't have legal documents and the legal right to stay in the country where they live. And they are under high pressure to return to Syria. And this pressure has increased with the normalisation. So it's not the normalisation itself which will lead to return, but for sure the pressure has released. And I would like to add something. We heard the Saudi Prime Minister saying that Syrian refugees want to return to Syria. What a recent survey from the UN Agency for Refugees show is that only 1% of Syrian refugees are thinking of returning to Syria in the coming year, 1%. So this is very clear.
So Karim is... go ahead, Omar. You go first. I'll go second. Go ahead.
Let me add something here. The Syrian regime doesn't want the refugees back. Iran and Syria doesn't want the refugees back. There is no way Iran would allow the regime to create circumstances for the refugees to go back, because that's against the ideology that the Iranian forces in Syria have. So Syria
Give us
cannot
an example, Omar. An example of the Syrian leadership showing that they don't want refugees to go home.
We have seen for the last many years Iran trying to buy out people out of their towns to build more of a stronger Shia community in the region. And Iran has been, in many ways, of course, by the pre-approval of the regime, not only buying people legally, but also legally by, threatening them. You either sell us your house or we kill you. And we have seen how they done that both in Damascus and Homs and different areas. So Iran doesn't want that because they're trying to turn Syria into a Shia place, like they did actually in, they want to have control over not only Iran, but Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon. That's why it's very important for us in Syria to protest in solidarity with the Iranian women on the street. The same thing with the Iraqi people that are, demanding the freedom from the Iranian forces' influence in Iraq. Same thing in Lebanon and so on.
Right.
So
let me bring Wafa in as well. Wafa, I know you've got something to add. Go ahead.
I totally agree. And I just maybe want to add that, obviously, a regime that arrests hundreds of thousands of its own people is a regime that does not really want people to return. And the fact that, we have now documentations of returnees being detained now last month by the Assad regime at the borders of Lebanon, I think it says it all. But also we're talking about a country where, Syria is not only a torture state, but Syria is also a failed state. The economic situation is horrific. The infrastructure is damaged. We're talking about a country that had just witnessed an earthquake, a country that could not actually, support its own people when the earthquake happened. So I think that, talking about a safe return to Syria is misleading, because I also want to emphasize that the term I use is not return, but rather deportation, because as also Marie emphasized that, most of the majority of refugees made it very clear that they do not want to go back to Assad's Syria.
Maria, I want to show our audience something, and then please jump in here, because what kind of returns are we talking about? A very tiny sliver of refugees want to go home. What kind of returns are we talking about? So, two really pieces of important information. Lebanon halts summary deportations of Syrian refugees. It's against international law to force refugees to go home if they don't want to go home, they don't feel it's safe. Turkey, hundreds of refugees deported to Syria. Can you talk to us, explain very clearly this idea of returning? What are the options, and what is a forced return where the refugees, they have no say in it?
Well, the examples you showed are examples where host countries' authorities, security forces forced refugees to return to Syria. They deported them. And this is exactly, as you said, against international law, because according to international law, any return of an individual who is at risk of suffering persecution is against international law, is illegal. So that's why these countries, Turkey, Lebanon, violate international law when they return Syrian refugees against their will.
I'm going to bring in Karim, who's a journalist. He is based in Lebanon, and he talks about the refugees he spoke to and what they would want to be in place before they went home. Here he is.
Syrian refugees in Lebanon continue struggling to cope with both aid cuts and the repercussions of the Lebanese economic crisis. At the same time, anti-refugee sentiment has certainly increased over the past year. Pressure has mounted on them to return, and there have been calls for mass repatriations. Lebanon formally welcomed Syria's return to the Arab League, and the authorities certainly hope this would be a catalyst to a resolution to the conflict and to have refugees return to Syria as quickly as possible. But talking to many refugees here, most of them would say that they want an end to the conflict and a guarantee to their safety, as well as investment in infrastructure so they can live in a dignified way and make a living.
So that is a very important to-do list, what we want before we go home. Wafa, I see you nodding your head. Are any of these ideal circumstances in place yet, or is anyone trying to help them be in place? For instance, the Arab League, normalising relations. So what are they doing to help Syrians feel safe at home? Wafa.
Well, I mean, I think they are doing nothing, and I think the plan and the step-by-step initiative that has been, talked about does not really guarantee any safety, does not really address, it fails to address the current conditions in Syria. And, I mean, we cannot just talk about, the Captagon and the refugees return without talking about what's happening inside Syria. I still have family in the Assad's held areas, and I know, like all of us, how much they're struggling, how difficult it is, even for people who do not have any political, opinions. And here we're not even talking about, the fact that there should not and there cannot be a solution or a justice or a future for a country where hundreds of thousands of people are somewhere between life and death. And actually, we have to consider that these people inside detention centers, they have millions of people, their families, their loved ones, their communities, who do not even dare to return to Syria. And even if they're in Syria, they do not even dare to talk about their detainees and demand their freedom. So we're talking about a country that is, unfortunately, it has been a kingdom built on fear, and it is still the case.
Look, over the last 12 years, over 1 million Syrians have been tortured by the Syrian regime. So let me tell you from my own perspective as someone who's been tortured for 3 years. There is no way on earth you can convince me to go back to the country where the regime that tortured me, where the security intelligence services who tortured me are still in power. They have the control to do anything. The intelligence services in Syria have full impunity. They can commit any crime. And we can see that in Wafa's story. Her dad is still in prison. She doesn't know where he is, if he's alive or dead. That's not only her dad's case. That's the case of so many fathers in Syria, so many mothers, sisters, brothers, family, friends in Syria. There's no way you can convince these over 1 million people who fled Syria, who were tortured by this regime, to return. But also you have the millions who were, bombed for so many years, chemical weapons for so many times, and saw the brutality of the regime. You have to remember, go back to the first thing. Why did we start our revolution? Why did we go out to the street in solidarity? Because the regime tortured the children in Daraa. That's why I went out to the street in my hometown in solidarity with the kids who were below 15 years old, whose fingernails were pulled out, their skin was taken out of their body. That's why I went out to the street. How would you want me? How do you believe that I would return to the same regime, to the same slaughterhouse? Prison system are still running. These torture chambers are still filled with people. People are being killed. And again, you mentioned one thing or two things many times, and that's international law and human rights law. I know no country, I know no one who respects these anymore. Where? In Syria, nobody respects human rights. You see people are dying on a daily basis. People are being tortured. Americans, not only Syrians, Americans are being tortured to death in Syria, like Laila Shwaykhani. You have Germans, French, Swedish, Norwegian, Italian, all these people being tortured in Syrian cells, and nobody respects, not even their own citizens or the citizens of other countries. There is pure disrespect of human rights, and you can see that through the UN. The UN has failed to provide aid to Rakban camp, and they forced on a small organization like the Syrian Emergency Task Force. Yesterday, gladly I can share, we broke the siege on Rakban camp, delivering an aid for over 8,000 people, 2,000 kids, and so many women and men that have been besieged for so long time. We managed to provide aid for the first time. Okay. And the United Nations, that's not united in anything, failed to do that.
Right, so Omar, we have the world, the international community has a really serious problem here, because if normalisation is making Syrians being pushed home against their will, how do you stop that from happening? Earlier we spoke to Nadia from Human Rights Watch.
The answer to the question of how to prevent Syrian refugees from being forcibly returned to Syria is simple. Allow Syrian refugees to maintain their protection space, their refugee status inside Syrian refugee host countries. Resettle more Syrian refugees from Turkey, Lebanon and Jordan, which host the highest number of refugees in the world. Conditions inside Syria continue to remain unsafe. There has been no accountability for crimes against humanity and grave human rights abuses committed by Assad and his militias inside Syria. And importantly, there is no way to monitor what happens to Syrian refugees when they go back to Syria. We have no way of knowing, actually, if someone is arbitrarily arrested and forcibly disappeared. But we do know that we cannot access them once they return to Syria.
So I guess they're all nodding at that. We'll be talking about the circumstances of people who are refugees. How are they managing? How are they coping? And then the push for them to go back home. I want you to hear of two refugees who are currently in Lebanon and the struggles that they are having. And I'm particularly touched by the younger generation who don't know any other life than their life as refugees. Let's have a look.
The situation is difficult. Look at my kids. When they came, they were around 2 or 3 years old, or 4 years old. The oldest of them was 4. Now he is 15, and his whole future is lost.
The kids go to school without having breakfast. Their teacher would sometimes call me and ask them why they didn't bring a sandwich. And I would say it's because I have nothing in the pantry. There is nothing. They eat 1 meal a day.
Marie, how do we get out of this situation? How do we make sure that countries who are supporting Syria are supporting Syrians, not necessarily a leadership that is still at odds with its own people? That's to put it politely. How do we get out of that situation so that Syrians are not suffering?
That's an incredibly difficult question. I think one key argument to have in mind is that even if Syrian refugees are pushed to return to Syria and obliged to return to Syria, they will not stay in the country unless the security is guaranteed and unless there is a political solution. And they will leave again, as we have seen and documented in past returns refugees, just don't stay in Syria because it's not safe. So even if host countries force them to return, it will be just a temporary solution and not a long-term solution, because they will come back to their country again.
Yes, I'm sure you've all seen and you've been part of these big international gatherings. How can we help Syria? How can we help Syria along the path to peace? Wafa was at one just quite recently, just a few days ago, the 7th Brussels Conference on Supporting the Future of Syria and the Region. It was organised by the European Union. I want you to hear the frustration of a Syrian who's been waiting for help for a long time. Let's have a look. Let's have a listen.
I'm not here to convince you that we deserve freedom, because we are entitled to freedom. I'm here, thank you, I'm here to say how angry, how frustrated, how disappointed, and how unsurprised I am that we've been here since this morning and we barely heard any conversation about detainees. We barely heard any conversation about normalization. And most importantly, we barely heard any conversation about a political solution. We've been here for 12 years. We've been, you've been exhausting our traumas. You've been exhausting our pain. You've been exhausting our stories. And for what? Nothing has changed.
What more is there to say? What's the action you need?
I mean, it is, to be honest, it's heartbreaking to watch myself. It's, one of the things that I really fear is that, our like ongoing trauma and our ongoing pain and struggle has been really normalized. We are expected as Syrians, as families of detainees, as survivors, as activists, we are expected, to still, tell our stories, provide solutions, give suggestions, compromise, and again and again and again. And we're invited to countless conferences and meetings and all of that. And unfortunately, I wish I had the luxury to say that, it's all pointless and I'll just give up. But I don't, as Omar said, I have a father in Assad's prisons. And, in a few days, unfortunately, my father will complete a whole decade of enforced disappearance. And that's, that literally means that I do not even know if my own father is still alive or not. We are deprived the answer to this question. And, I think, I know and I also said in that conference that, we're always asked for, to provide solutions. And every time we say that my demand is the freedom of my father and all other Syrians disappeared, I'm told on daily basis that this is unpractical and unrealistic, and I need to find a more practical and realistic demand. And I think this also shows the amount of violence and, insensitivity that we have to go through on daily basis. I believe the solution for Syria, for a safe return for refugees, and for any future of Syria must start with the release of all detainees, the end of the ongoing detentions, and the prosecution of all war criminals, starting with Assad himself. And I know for myself, and I know for many Syrians, that we will accept nothing less than that.
I'm going to share with you some thoughts that came from our YouTube community. Felipe says, do you remember our question was, is it safe for refugees to return? We've had the answer from sort of the first 2 minutes of this discussion. Felipe says, who would want to return under those circumstances? Lucas says, I do not blame Syrians for fighting for a better life elsewhere. I'm going to end with a thought which came from World Refugee Day. It's the theme for World Refugee Day for 2023. Hope away from home. Omar, in a minute, do you have that?
I have so much hope because I saw it myself when I was smuggled out of prison after 3 years. I thought every single day I will die under torture, but then I'm here today. I see hope in every Syrian who is still fighting. I see so much hope in Wafa. I see so much hope every day I wake up, and I have motivation to still tell this story. Because as Wafa said, the world is used to hear our stories, expecting to hear our story endlessly.
Thank you for bringing your stories to the stream, and Wafa, and Marie as well. Hopefully they will have so much more impact in some of those big international gatherings. It will make a difference. We really appreciate you helping us understand. Is it safe for Syrians to go back home? You heard the answer right here on the stream. Thanks for watching. I will see you next time. This has been a Lisa Thompson production. Thanks, Lisa.